On a warm Roman evening, beneath oil lamps and painted ceilings, a bride was led into marriage not with joy, but with trembling silence. Outside, flutes played and guests laughed, convinced they were witnessing the foundation of family, order, and empire. Inside the bridal chamber, rituals older than law unfolded, rites Rome later denied, softened, or quietly erased. The bride's hair was torn into symbolic strands, her body guided by hands that were not always gentle, her fear dismissed as tradition. Mothers whispered that endurance was virtue. Fathers called it duty. Rome claimed these acts shaped obedient wives and stable homes, yet the walls absorbed sounds history chose to forget. What was celebrated as sacred union often felt like sanctioned violation, wrapped in ceremony and applause. The empire that built roads and laws could not admit what it demanded of its women on that first night. And this was only the beginning, the real cruelty was yet to come. Before marriage reduced her name to someone's wife, a Roman girl lived a life tightly measured by expectation. From childhood, she learned silence before speech and obedience before desire. Her world revolved around the domus, where women spun wool, managed servants, and guarded family honor like a fragile flame. She was taught that her body did not belong to her, but to lineage, alliances, and the future sons Rome demanded. Marriage was not romance, it was strategy. Fathers negotiated unions as carefully as land deals, trading daughters to strengthen political ties or preserve wealth. The girl herself was rarely consulted. She was raised on stories of virtuous matrons who endured without complaint, women praised not for happiness but for submission. Rome glorified this sacrifice, presenting it as the cornerstone of civilization. Publicly, weddings glittered with feasts, torches, and hymns to fertility. Privately, fear crept in long before the ceremony. Older women offered rehearsed reassurances, warning her never to resist, never to cry out too loudly. Law protected the husband's authority completely, framing control as order. In this world, the bride's value was purity before marriage and obedience after. Everything she was prepared her for that single night, when childhood ended and duty began. Yet no lesson truly prepared her for what awaited behind the closed door, where tradition ruled more harshly than any law Rome ever wrote. The breaking point did not come with violence announced or voices raised. It came with the quiet click of a door closing behind her. One moment she stood surrounded by ritual, women adjusting her veil, hands guiding her steps, words spoken as commands disguised as blessings. The next, she was alone with a man chosen for her, in a room heavy with incense and expectation. Roman custom called this transition sacred, but to the bride it felt like erasure. Her fear was not accidental, it was designed. She was expected to resist just enough to prove modesty, then surrender completely to prove virtue. Any hesitation was interpreted as disobedience, any tears as childish weakness. The law sided with the husband, culture applauded him, and the gods were said to approve. In that moment, the bride understood something Rome never wrote down: there would be no appeal, no witness who mattered. Her body had crossed an invisible boundary, from protected property to controlled possession. What she felt, confusion, terror, dissociation, had no language in Roman law. The rituals that followed were meant to break resistance quickly, to teach her that endurance was survival. This was the night Rome framed as transformation, yet it functioned as conditioning. By dawn, she was expected to rise as a matron, composed and grateful, her suffering already dismissed as necessary. The girl she had been did not vanish dramatically, she faded quietly, piece by piece, in a space where tradition outweighed consent. And as the city woke to another ordinary morning, the bride realized this was not a single ordeal but the first lesson of a life defined by silence. After the wedding night, celebration did not end, it moved outside, leaving the bride behind. While relatives feasted and joked about fertility and heirs, she remained confined within the marital chamber, her world reduced to stone walls and ritual silence. Roman custom demanded seclusion, claiming it fostered modesty and obedience. In reality, it severed her from every familiar comfort. Her mother was gone. Her childhood home was no longer hers. Even her name began to fade, replaced by her husband's lineage. The room smelled of extinguished lamps and wilted garlands, symbols of joy already decaying. Servants entered only when summoned, eyes lowered, pretending not to notice her distress. She learned quickly that no one wished to hear her thoughts. Isolation was not accidental, it was instructional. Alone, she replayed the night in fragments, unsure which parts she was allowed to remember and which she must bury. Fear settled into routine. Each sound beyond the door reminded her that life continued without pause, indifferent to her internal collapse. Rome praised this silence, calling it dignity. The bride felt it as erasure. Cut off from counsel, she began to internalize blame, wondering if obedience might eventually bring peace. This chamber, meant to initiate her into womanhood, became a quiet prison. The empire never needed chains or guards here. Tradition itself sealed the door, teaching her that endurance, not resistance, was the only path forward. Humiliation in Rome did not always come through cruelty alone, it came through exposure. In the days that followed, the bride was expected to appear before family and household as proof that the ritual had succeeded. Older women inspected her with knowing looks, offering advice disguised as judgment. Any sign of discomfort was corrected publicly, framed as ignorance that needed discipline. Jokes were made at her expense, laughter soft but sharp, reminding her that her private suffering was now communal property. Even praise carried weight, she was complimented for endurance, not strength. Her husband's authority was reinforced in subtle ways, his words carried finality, his gestures expectation. Servants watched carefully, learning how she should behave. Rome used environment as pressure, shared meals, crowded atriums, constant observation. There was no space to grieve what she had lost. Fear of dishonor kept her silent, because speaking would mark her as disobedient. The city did not whip these women in the streets, it molded them through shame. Every correction, every glance, trained her to police herself. Over time, humiliation became internal, a quiet voice reminding her to endure, to comply, to disappear. This was Rome's brilliance and its cruelty, control achieved without visible force. By making obedience public and pain private, the empire ensured that no scream ever reached history's ears, only smiles carved carefully into memory. There was no courtroom for her, no formal judgment pronounced aloud. The final confrontation arrived instead as certainty. Through repeated instruction, corrected behavior, and unspoken rules, the bride came to understand that resistance itself was the crime. Roman law did not need to threaten her, it surrounded her. Fathers, husbands, priests, and poets all spoke with one voice, duty above self. In this realization, something hardened within her. She recognized that her feelings were irrelevant to the system she had been absorbed into. Yet in that same moment, a quiet dignity emerged. She learned to choose survival consciously, to preserve a private self no ritual could fully claim. Perhaps she whispered a prayer to household gods, or remembered her mother's face before obedience replaced warmth. These small acts became her defiance. Rome never saw this confrontation because it happened inwardly, where empire had limited reach. Outwardly, she complied. Inwardly, she marked the boundary of what could still be hers. The city recorded successful marriages, healthy heirs, and stable households. It never recorded the internal negotiations women made to endure. This silent reckoning, between law and humanity, was the closest she would come to justice. And though Rome believed the ritual complete, something remained unresolved, waiting for a moment history would finally listen. Rome did not end her story with death, but with repetition. The last moments of the girl she had been unfolded slowly, across years rather than minutes. Each morning she rose into a role fully formed by that first night: wife, keeper of order, bearer of heirs. Any softness that survived was carefully hidden. Pregnancy, childbirth, and household duty layered over the memory, burying it beneath routine. Yet certain nights, when the house was quiet, fragments returned, the closed door, the weight of expectation, the realization that choice had never existed. These memories no longer caused panic, they caused distance. She learned to move through life as Rome rewarded her, calm, composed, productive. Outsiders saw success. Inside, she measured survival as victory. The final death was not physical but personal. The spontaneous girl, the unguarded self, faded until even she struggled to recall her face. Rome considered this outcome ideal, a woman fully shaped by duty. No ceremony marked this transformation. No witness recorded the cost. And when she eventually taught her own daughters the same customs, her voice carried both instruction and warning. History would later call these marriages normal, necessary, even noble. But the true ending of the ritual lived on quietly, in generations trained to endure without naming what they lost. Centuries later, Rome remembered its weddings as symbols of civilization, lawful unions that built families, property, and empire. Statues showed serene brides. Texts praised harmony and order. What vanished were the silences that made those images possible. The rituals were softened by language, reframed as symbolic gestures rather than instruments of control. Historians debated legality, poets celebrated virtue, and the suffering dissolved into footnotes or disappeared entirely. Yet traces survived in patterns passed down, expectations of obedience, praise for endurance, the belief that discomfort was a woman's duty. Rome collapsed, but this lesson endured far beyond its ruins. The empire tried to erase the cruelty by calling it tradition, by insisting it was necessary, by refusing to listen to those who lived it. But history is never fully obedient. In fragments of law, in warnings whispered between mothers and daughters, the truth remained. These wedding nights were not accidents of a brutal age, they were deliberate tools of order. Remembering them does not destroy history, it completes it. Rome wanted its power remembered, not its cost. Yet the cost shaped generations just as surely as roads and legions. And though the empire fell, this story did not vanish. It waited. And now, it refuses to stay buried.